Okay, folks, here we are for our first lecture in Introduction to Philosophy. As in many classes, you kind of start off with a what is what's the basic idea of that discipline talk. This is especially important in philosophy because unlike many of the other subjects you might study in college, it's likely that you haven't had a philosophy class before, since it's not taught in primary or secondary schools, at least here in the US typically. There are some schools that teach it, but that's more of the exception than the general rule. People often show up to philosophy class thinking all sorts of things, or having with all sorts of expectations about what the class will be like, or maybe what the academic expectations will be like because of what they think philosophy is. And so I like to start off with kind of a big picture view of what philosophy, academic philosophy, is about, the academic discipline of philosophy. That's what we're here to learn about. And so one of the things, what I would like to do in this lecture is to give you a couple of more technical definitions of what philosophy is, again, in terms of the academic discipline, an overview of some of the basic subfields of academic philosophy, and then look at a little bit of a philosophical aptitude test to start you thinking about how one goes about doing philosophy towards the end of the presentation. And so with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started here. So what is philosophy? If you, again, most people have some kind of conception of philosophy. You might have heard of Socrates before. Ancient Greek philosopher that a lot of people at least know his name and know that he was a person that existed. Not the first philosopher in Western philosophy, but one of the first well-known ones, at least popularly. There are about 10 philosophers that academics usually call the pre-Socratic philosophers leading up to Socrates, but he's probably the one that you might have heard of before. And Socrates thought of philosophy as the examined life. And thought that, as I quote here, that the unexamined life is not worth living. So that is one way of thinking about what philosophy is. It's thinking of philosophy more as a way of life necessarily than an academic discipline, although the two do have a connection between them. Again, what I want to do here is to start to give you a more technical definition of academic philosophy in order to help distinguish it from, say, what science does, even though there are some points of comparison and contrast there, some overlap. Because in Rick and Morty, as you know, we're doing philosophy through Rick and Morty. Rick is not, that character is not a philosopher, he is a scientist, right? And so one of the things that we can get out of our more technical definition is a distinction between, at least with regard to more exemplary questions or theories, what would count as a philosophical theory versus a straightforward scientific theory, for example. So again, Socrates' idea here is that the unexamined life is not worth living. That gives us the idea that philosophy at least has something to do with the examined life. One way of thinking about what we're up to here is to think about the life's big questions, or the big questions of the human condition or human existence. We get lots of examples of the unexamined life in pop culture, as much as they might be lovable characters. Peter Griffin and Homer Simpson are not the most reflective individuals in this regard, or they're not like paradigmatic critical thinkers or anything like that. Much of the humor in Family Guy and The Simpsons is driven from the lack of reflection on their part, or the idea that they don't examine their beliefs or ideas very much. If you were to just Google the definition of philosophy, here is what you would get. So philosophy, the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence, especially when considered as an academic discipline. So there's our kind of first pass at a more technical definition of what we mean by philosophy that's related to, again, academic philosophy. In this course, we'll study the basic areas of philosophy that deal with knowledge, reality, and existence, as well as morality and value. You might also hear people use the term philosophy to refer to a particular system of philosophical thought, like a school of philosophy. Say, for example, libertarianism as a political philosophy, or conservatism as a political philosophy, or theism as a religious school of thought in terms of philosophical thought there. And then the last definition there is the study of the theoretical basis of a particular branch of knowledge or experience. And so that last definition even has a long history for us. The highest degree that you can earn in higher education is a PhD, which stands for Doctor of Philosophy. And you can see that name, the Doctor of Philosophy, being reflected there in that last definition of philosophy, to study the theoretical basis of a particular branch of knowledge, like a particular academic discipline or experience there. So in other words, the highest level or deepest level of learning that you can achieve in that discipline. Here is another definition of philosophy, again, more technical. This comes from the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. We'll study Stoicism at the very end, towards the very end of this class, as an ancient Roman philosopher. And here's what he had to say about kind of conceiving of what philosophy is up to. So he says, behold the beginning of philosophy, a recognition of the conflict between the opinions of people, a search for the origin of that conflict, a skepticism regarding it, and a kind of investigation to determine whether the opinion is rightly held. Many people, it's understandable why they might show up to a philosophy class in college thinking this. They kind of think that philosophy is just about expressing your opinion or just whatever you happen to feel or happen to believe about a particular subject or a particular problem or question. But it really goes beyond that. So if you think about what he's up to in this definition of philosophy, he says it's the recognition of the conflict between the opinions of people. Well, that's not hard to recognize for us. We are inundated in social media and a media-rich environment with conflicting opinions about things. A search for the origin of that conflict. So what are they really disagreeing about? Is there a legitimate or a real disagreement there, or is there just some confusion over words that makes it look like there's a disagreement, so a real disagreement as opposed to an apparent one? And then he says a skepticism regarding it. Well, if there are two opinions or they're the exact opposite of one another, they can't both be right. So as Epictetus emphasizes here, he says a skepticism regarding that conflict of an opinion and a kind of investigation to determine whether the opinion is rightly held. It's easy to have an opinion about something or to feel a certain way about something, to have a gut reaction to something, but it's more difficult to determine whether the opinion is true, whether it's actually a true belief, as opposed to something that we might just call a mere opinion or a mere belief, right? And that's really where academic philosophy and doing philosophy comes into play. It's not just articulating your beliefs or your feelings, but it is a search for, a rational search for the truth of the matter, as best we can figure that out. And sometimes it's difficult to figure that out. In fact, much of what you're doing, especially in a lower level philosophy class like this, is learning what the debates are and learning what philosophical questions are and what some of the main schools of thought are with regard to that question or debate. And so central to doing philosophy in a rigorous academic or intellectual way involves the production of arguments and the analysis of arguments. And so that's why the next main topic that we're going to study is a little bit of basic logic. And so that's what Epictetus is up to here, is we need to have an investigation to determine whether the opinion is rightly held. In other words, one of the central distinctions in philosophy is believing something on the basis of good evidence and good reasons versus insufficient evidence or bad reasons and insufficient reasons. And so part of the section on logic that we'll look at next is about how to make a distinction between those two things, good reasoning versus bad reasoning. And so there's a little bit on Epictetus, and now we're going to get to a much more technical definition of philosophy. The one that I'll use is our working definition of philosophy throughout the class. Although it comes from another textbook that I often use, I'm not using that particular textbook. This semester we're using a Rick and Morty textbook, but I still like this definition of philosophy as a working definition for our purposes. And so here's what I'm going to call the textbook or the technical definition of philosophy. So if you ever see me refer to that notion of a textbook definition or the technical definition of philosophy, this is the definition that I mean and that I have in mind. So this comes from a book called Classic Questions in Contemporary Film, An Introduction to Philosophy, which is just another a textbook of philosophy that uses pop culture as well to introduce students to philosophy. And here's how the author, Klosowski, defines philosophy. Again, this is going to be our working definition of philosophy. So it's the intellectual activity that involves attempting to discern and remove contradictions among non-empirical reasoned beliefs that have universal importance, with the resulting benefit of achieving a greater understanding of the world and our place within it. So there's a lot packed in there, right? So first, well, what we can do here is think about each element in that definition, right? So first, attempting to discern and remove contradictions. So we can think of ideas. They aren't isolated from one another. They have relationships to other ideas, right? And so one of the things to think about what a system of thought might be is to think about the web of beliefs and their relationships to one another, their logical relationships to one another, or reasoned relationships between one another. And all of us, in varying degrees and in varying ways, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, hold contradictory beliefs, or beliefs that are inconsistent or incompatible with one another. And so the first aspect of this definition of philosophy is attempting to discern and remove those contradictions. We'll worry about what it would mean to remove the contradictions here, again, by looking at arguments coming up in the next lecture. So just to give a explicit and blatant example of a contradiction, some people believe, have the metaphysical view that there is at least one God, or a God that exists, and other people claim that there are no gods, there are no supernatural beings that exist. Well, there's a contradiction between those two beliefs, right? So there at least a conflict between the opinions of different people about a particular matter. So there's an example. Again, you have some people that believe that there is free will, and other people believe that there is no free will. Some people believe that the mind, or the human person, is all physical, and others believe that the human being is at least part non-physical, that they have a mind, a non-physical mind, an immaterial mind or soul in some way. Some people believe that there is at least one universal and objective moral truth, and other people believe that there are no objective universal moral truths. So the conflict of opinions there, contradictions, right? The next kind of key thing here in this definition is the idea of a non-empirical belief, right? So this is really what would distinguish philosophy from Rick the scientist, right? Especially the natural scientist, which is what I'm thinking about here. So in the scientific method, what you do is you go out and you observe the natural world, right? Science is based on what we can observe about the natural world. So a simple, silly kind of example of an empirical question, a question that can be answered on the basis of observation of the world, is a question like, how many people are in the room right now? Do I have high blood pressure or not? How many books are on the shelf behind me? We can go and count those things up, right? So an empirical question. The natural sciences go about doing that through the scientific method. And any question that is at least in principle answerable on the basis of observation of the world, even if it's observation that is enhanced by technology, microscopes and telescopes and this sort of stuff, measuring the world, right? Those are empirical matters, right? So there are lots of important empirical questions. Rick, in Rick and Morty, he looks at love in an empirical way. He says it's just the chemical reaction, right, in the brain. That's what we call love. It's really just a chemical reaction. So chemistry is a natural science, right? Biology, lots and lots of physics, although theoretical physics, the distinction between empirical and non-empirical starts to get a little crazy. That's why things like string theory or the multiverse theory are often viewed as non-science, because they cannot be empirically tested, or at least the way they're formulated now, there is no way to empirically test them. So one question we might have is whether the idea of the multiverse, is that really more of a philosophy, or is that really more of a science, right? But in terms of simpler issues, if it is in principle answerable through observation of the world, some form of observation and testing and measuring of the world, then it's an empirical matter. Right? Philosophy, however, deals with non-empirical matters. So again, go back to that idea of the belief in the existence of a God. It's not like you can run up against and observe a physical being named God, right? And here I'm using the term God to refer to a supernatural being, a spiritual being, or something like that. Empirical information might be relevant to figuring out whether there's a supernatural being or not, but it's not like we have direct observation, certainly not direct observation of a God or supernatural being through our senses, right? Through sense experience of the world. Nevertheless, these non-empirical issues are issues about which reasons can be marshaled and given for and against the truth of these claims. They're also claims that have universal importance. Sometimes students get hung up on this idea of universal importance because they say, well, you know, they might say something like, I'm not interested in philosophy or something like that, therefore it's not universally important. But the sense of universal importance here isn't about whether a particular individual happens to be interested personally in the subject matter or the question. It's whether or not that issue is relevant to them as a human being. So even if you're not interested in, say, biology is still interested in you because you're a biological being, right? And insofar as we are all thinking and reasoning beings, right, that have non-empirical beliefs about the ultimate nature of reality, the nature of value, what we can know versus what just counts as mere opinion or morality. Many of those issues are non-empirical and seem like they cannot be answered just through observation of the world, and yet they seem inescapable issues. So that's what it means by universal importance here. Even if I'm not particularly interested in religion, if there is the sort of supernatural being that exists that's either going to punish or reward me in an afterlife, even if I'm not really interested in religion, that's the kind of universal importance that issue has. Is it's still relevant to me despite my lack of interest in it, because it has to do with my place in the world and my place in the universe, right? And what is or isn't going to happen to me upon the death of my physical body. So there's some key elements then in that definition. And that idea of a contradiction will be very important for us throughout the semester. There will be some other logical issues that we need to worry about, but the idea of a contradiction is very much important. So again, as an idea of what it would mean to do philosophy, we need to worry about that idea of a contradiction, and I'll come back to that here at the end here a little bit. We'll employ that idea of a contradiction. So here then, so that's the textbook or technical definition of philosophy that we'll work with this semester. As we go through the different topics that we look at, you should always kind of have that definition in the back of your mind and think about, well, what are the non-empirical aspects of this issue, right, that we're looking at, whether it's a metaphysical issue like the nature of a personal identity, which is the first big philosophical metaphysical problem we'll look at, or the idea of whether we live in a simulation or not, or the nature of morality. Excuse me. All of those are going to have some non-empirical elements to them. Here then is another definition of philosophy. If you were to trap me in the corner at a cocktail party or something like that in the grocery store and ask me what philosophy is, here's the definition that I would probably give you. So philosophy is the critical, reflective, and well-reasoned inquiry into and attempt to address the fundamental, non-empirical, or conceptual questions of the human condition. So again, the human condition, not Chris Blakely's condition, but the human condition. Human beings are the sort of beings that reason and wonder and ask these non-empirical questions. And so philosophy is a discipline that devotes its time and energy and its methods of inquiry and analysis to trying to figure out as best we can what the most plausible or even the best answers, most well-reasoned answers, right, to those issues. So again, the difference between a well-reasoned argument and a poorly reasoned argument is going to be fundamental for us. In philosophy, the idea is that you have to follow the logic of the arguments to the conclusion that that are most well supported by the best arguments. So in the sciences, we sometimes say things like, you follow the evidence to the conclusion that it leads. Well, in philosophy, we follow the arguments to the conclusion that are most likely to support with the best arguments again. And again, we'll get into this issue of what counts as a good versus a bad reason or a good versus a bad argument in the next lesson. So again, non-empirical or conceptual questions about free will, God's existence, the nature of knowledge itself. Everybody claims to know something. Well, what do we mean by that concept of know or knowledge? What do you mean by that precisely? So in a lot of ways, what philosophy involves is thinking about some of the ideas we employ, often without thinking about them very much, and devoting attention to them, trying to figure out what we really mean by the difference between knowledge versus mere belief, or what we mean by morality, or what justifies certain moral judgments over others, as opposed to just walking around and doing those things, right? Or employing those ideas uncritically or unreflectively. So in the academic study of philosophy, here's kind of the two big main objectives that we're trying to achieve here. First is we want you to understand a little bit more about the ideas of some influential philosophers that have shaped culture and civilization. The United States of America, the kind of constitution it has, is deeply influenced by the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. The idea of inalienable rights that is in the Declaration of Independence is an idea that's central in modern political philosophy, for example, John Locke. So some people think philosophy is very far removed from their everyday lives, but it's really not. It's just that in academic philosophy, what you do is devote a lot of attention to some topics that sometimes people just kind of sit on their couches and yell about at the TV or something like that. Right? And by studying philosophy and the arguments for and against these different positions and views or schools of thought, we develop our own critical thinking and reasoning abilities, right? So in the same way you get to be a better swimmer by getting in the pool and doing swimming, you develop your critical thinking and logical reasoning skills by reading about and thinking about arguments. So here are some basic subfields of academic philosophy. In the article that I had you read for class today, What Makes Rick Tick, they go through some of the basic subfields. And so you can start to think yourself, just as that author goes through and talks about Rick's philosophy, what makes him tick is his philosophy, and his particular views on certain philosophical subfields. You can start to ask yourself what you believe about each of those sorts of issues. To start thinking about what are your initial philosophical views or intuitions or maybe gut reactions, right? Everybody shows up to philosophy class with some philosophical beliefs already in place. But then by studying what other people have written and thought about and argued and criticized with regard to those things, we further develop our views. Sometimes we change them, sometimes we refine them, sometimes we modify them or revise them in subtle ways. Sometimes we end up rejecting them altogether. I'll give an example again of that coming up here towards the end. So the first main area of philosophy is logic, very closely related to math, actually, especially when we talk about formal logic. So logic is the study of good and bad forms of reasoning. And by good and bad there, I don't mean just effective for persuading people. I mean rational persuasion as opposed to maybe emotionally persuading or manipulating somebody. All about that. So we'll look at some basic forms of argumentation and some basic types of logic, as well as logical errors to avoid, like violating the law of non-contradiction coming up. And we have, so logic kind of cuts through all the other areas, because whether we're worried about the nature of knowledge or a metaphysical issue like God's existence, or the nature of personal identity, or moral issues or political issues, or issues about beauty, providing arguments for those views is central, and logic is about arguments. So a very fundamental aspect of academic philosophy, especially. Lots of people like to ask philosophical questions, but if you really want to try to figure out the answers, the best plausible answers to those questions, you need to study some logic in order to have a well-reasoned versus a poorly reasoned argument. So that notion of a reasoned belief, we don't just want to give reasons, we want to give good logical reasons as opposed to bad logical or illogical reasons for those beliefs. In class, I'll press everyone. Well, why should we think that that's true? And why should we accept that as a good reason for the truth of this other claim that you're trying to defend? And you'll see various, in the readings for the class, you'll see the authors talking about that very thing with regard to different philosophical positions. So next up is epistemology, or theory of knowledge. We all claim to know various things. Well, what distinguishes genuine knowledge from, let's say, mere belief? Or mere opinions. I'm going to use opinion. I know Epictetus talked about this in a slightly different way in that definition that I gave you earlier, but I'm going to use the term opinion, or to just refer to mere belief, right? Just so that on its own wouldn't constitute knowledge, right? So we want to move from having opinions to having true beliefs about these sorts of things, right? Whether it's the nature of personal identity, God's existence, nature of morality, and so forth. Then metaphysics, that has to do with the nature of reality itself. So in Rick and Morty, reality is comprised of a multiverse where there are actual, parallel, actual existing, right, reality, existence, in independent universes, right? So that's a metaphysical claim there. The ideas of personal identity are also metaphysical issues. And so we'll start off the first half of the semester up to the midterm will be, after we get past the logic lesson next, we'll look at a metaphysical issue, the personal identity in the context of Rick and Morty. And then, how do you know that you're not living in a simulation, like sometimes happens in Rick and Morty in the show. So that's an epistemological issue. And of course, those two things go hand in hand, because when we talk about the nature of knowledge, we're always worried about the knowledge of something. Well, so how do I know whether what I'm experiencing right now is genuine base reality versus a simulation of reality? How do I know what's real? So epistemology is about the knowledge part, and then metaphysics is about what constitutes the reality part, the nature of that real versus the unreal or not real. So that's what metaphysics is. It's the study of the fundamental nature of reality. Moral and political philosophy are closely related. They're both concerned with issues of justice and how we should live as either individuals or as societies. What's the best way to organize society? Fundamental question of political philosophy. What is justice? Again, it overlaps both of those two things. Big issues in moral philosophy include the nature of morality. Are there any universal and objective moral truths, or is morality all a matter of personal opinion or cultural belief? So again, Rick and Morty, when Rick goes into the microverse and he tells them that giving the middle finger means peace among worlds, that's a meaning that is relative to that particular group of people. But if you ran around in our universe and did that thing, you're going to get some looks, right? So is morality like that? Is all of morality like that, or are there some objective and universal moral truths, a prescriptive truth, right? So for example, maybe the golden rule, maybe that really applies to everywhere, all peoples, all times and places, not just people in particular times and places. And so there's be called metaethics, the metaphysical and epistemological issues about morality there. Then there's normative ethical theory, and normative ethical theory involves attempting to identify and defend some prescriptive standard, like the golden rule or the other ones that we'll look at later in the semester, as being not just a principle just for an individual or a culture, but typically normative ethics presupposes some account of objectivity and universality. So we'll look at those issues later in the semester. We'll look at a little bit of political philosophy along the way there. And then there's aesthetics or philosophy of art. So what's the nature of beauty? Again, is that all in the eye of the beholder, or are there universal and objective standards of beauty? And then other things that you might learn about in academic philosophy, taking philosophy classes, is the history of philosophy. So we'll do a little bit of that as well in this class. We'll look at a lot of classical formulations of some of these positions versus some contemporary formulations or arguments about those issues. If you were a philosophy minor or major, you'd take classes in the history of philosophy to learn about the influential theories that have developed and then how those get revised or rejected in contemporary thought. And then over here, there are some other areas and subfields of philosophy as well. Rick and Morty deals with the question of the meaning of life, or the meaning of existence a lot. That's a question that fits in with existentialism. Questions about the nature of personal identity fit with the philosophy of mind. We'll look at the Get Swifty episode with regard to the philosophy of religion. And then, as I mentioned earlier, with that Google search definition of philosophy, the fundamental branch of any area of knowledge or experience, that's where that philosophy of blank would fill in. So there's a philosophy of education. You can go major in education, but the philosophy of education would deal with questions that are like, you know, what's the genuine purpose of education? Is it character formation, or is it just technical training, that kind of thing? Likewise, in the philosophy of science, we could have done a bunch with philosophy of science in this class with Rick and Morty, since Rick is a scientist, makes lots of scientific claims. The practicing scientists typically go on about their business applying the scientific method, but the philosophy of science would deal with questions like how do we rigorously distinguish between genuine science, pseudoscience, and non-science, or the difference between the natural sciences or the hard sciences versus the soft sciences, the social sciences, right? How do we precisely distinguish between those two things? So again, some of the basic areas of academic philosophy. And again, when you're reading that article, or hopefully you've already read it, what makes Rick tick, the author goes through and talks about Rick's views in some of those main subfields of academic philosophy. And then here's some examples of various philosophical questions, again, that match up with those different subfields of academic philosophy. So in epistemology, we're worried about the nature of truth, what justifies a belief, right? How do we distinguish between genuine knowledge from mere opinion? Those are epistemological questions. And again, we'll worry about how do I know, or can I know, whether I'm in the real world or a simulation of the real world, a theme that runs through a lot of Rick and Morty episodes. What distinguishes mere appearance from reality, right? How does the mind relate to the body? Or as we'll look at, what's the nature of personal identity in the multiverse? What makes me me? If there are an infinite number of me's, right? Are we all the same me, really? Or are we different in some way? This is the question of identity there. Is morality objective or subjective, right? What's the nature of justice? What is freedom? What makes government or political authority legitimate as opposed to illegitimate? Those are central questions of political philosophy. Again, we'll deal with a little bit of that in the second half of the class as well, although most of that section of the course is on moral philosophy and a little bit of existentialism in there as well. And then what's the nature of beauty? Again, what is art? How do we precisely define those sorts of things? So a lot of times in philosophy, you might hear a question like, what is blank? Or like, what is art? And if we have a tendency to say, well, let's just look that up in the dictionary, right? But the dictionary or lexical definitions don't really resolve the question that's really being asked there. So a lot of times in academic philosophy, you might hear somebody say something like, if you think that, you know, the answer to the question, what is blank, is simple, then you probably have really missed what the question is really asking about there. So that's a little bit of something to watch out for there. If I were to ask the class, what is justice? I'm not asking for the dictionary definition of justice. I'm asking you to engage the debates over different conceptions of justice, right? Different definitions of justice. That's the central theme in Plato's Republic, one of the first major works of political and moral philosophy in Western thought. And so those are, again, some basic philosophical questions, and we'll take up we'll look at various attempts to answer those through our reasoned beliefs and argumentation there throughout the course. Again, as I've already mentioned, we're going to use Rick and Morty as a way of introducing y'all to academic philosophy. The reason why Rick and Morty makes such fertile ground to do an introduction to philosophy class is because the show regularly deals with many of the basic questions of academic philosophy. So there's a bit of an overlap there. There are lots of philosophical themes in Rick and Morty. The issue of the meaning of existence, right? And nihilism, that nothing matters. Rick appears to be a nihilist much of the time, so we'll worry about that. Sometimes characters express philosophical views about the meaning of life explicitly. It's not just an implicit theme in the film, but an explicit topic. And sometimes particular characters espouse particular philosophical positions. Morty often takes issue, or other characters often take issue with Rick's conduct, for example, and claim that he's wrong for doing something. Well, what might justify that claim of wrongness? So the show is a pretty philosophical show, even though it's kind of a sci-fi horror comedy. And even though we don't have a character that's a philosopher on the show, there's lots of philosophy in the show overtly. And so it makes really good material for introducing people to philosophy. It gives you a nice pop culture example to then use as a springboard to discussing the philosophical ideas themselves. And so that's what we'll be up to in this class. So we might wonder then, can philosophy solve the problems it addresses? Well, in an introduction to philosophy class, you need to get used to being frustrated, because it's my job to, in many ways, it's my job to frustrate you because I'm going to present some basic views on philosophical issues. I'm going to give an argument and a criticism of it, and it's going to be difficult to figure out which one of those might be right. In this class, what I'm going to do is basically oversimplify things. So figuring out the answer to if there were a final answer, a final once and for all definitive answer to a philosophical question, you'd have to go through many, many arguments and many, many criticisms and debates over those arguments to figure that out. Well, in this class, what we're going to basically do is oversimplify that, look at one argument or maybe a couple arguments for one position and some criticisms of those, but we're going to leave out the surrounding debate, right? Because we just don't have time to do all that stuff. So in an introduction to philosophy class, what we're going to do is try to get clear about what some of the basic issues are, and then what are some of the classical and a few of the contemporary positions and arguments that have been developed with regard to those issues, and start to get an idea of what's involved in analyzing those issues. So that's what we should basically expect. That's not to say that with regard to philosophical questions that any answer is as good as any other. So, and I'll come back to that notion both at the end of this presentation and in the next lecture on basic logic. We'll start to worry about what would count as a good versus a bad argument there, so that we can resolve those contradictions or attempt to resolve those contradictions between non-empirical beliefs. So the way we'll go about that is look at one side of the debate and the other side of the debate. And again, that's an oversimplification, because usually there are more than two positions on any particular issue. Start to look at the arguments for those positions, and then try and figure out which of those might be have the better arguments, at least between the ones that we're evaluating. And again, any one of the issues that we look at in the semester, you could spend the rest of your life studying. That's what academic philosophers do. So we should expect modest results here, right? Again, just getting clear about what the issues are, what the questions are, and some of the basic positions that people have taken, some of the basic reasons they've given for and against those positions. And even if we don't get the final answer to the question of personal identity, we're still developing our abilities in critical thinking and logical reasoning, which are very useful in regard to other less difficult questions or issues, right? I use philosophy every day in my life. People ask me to believe certain things or do certain things versus others. And when those are important, significant issues, I think through the reasons for and against why I should believe that or not believe that, and then does some action follow from that belief. So although we deal with a lot of abstract issues, it's there's a lot of practical use to thinking about philosophy and doing philosophy. Even if you never worry about the question, what is justice again, or Plato's Republic, or the issue of personal identity again, you're going to have to argue with your roommate about something, or you're going to have to argue with an insurance company about something, and having some philosophical reasoning skills can come in handy there. Not too long ago, I had to have an argument with my dental insurance. They gave me contradictory answers about whether something was going to be covered or not covered. And I had to give them reasons why. Look, you said this one thing, this other thing is not in the policy, so this is what the conclusion ought to be, right? it got covered. Again, even if you're not really worried or interested in philosophical issues, although I'm willing to bet you really are if you think about it, because these are issues that are fundamental to us, not only as individuals, but as human beings as such. You can get a lot of use out of a philosophy class if you give it a shot. And so again, as I say here, we should expect modest results, tentative results, because someone also might always come along with a better, more subtle argument. You got to be open to revising your beliefs on the basis of new information and better arguments. Some people are opposed to that idea. They just stand their ground, and they just say, I'm going to believe X no matter what. That kind of attitude is not going to help you out in philosophy. It's not going to help you out in school. It's fundamentally opposed to the basic aims of higher education. So doing philosophy does involve what you're signing up for when you sign up to do philosophy and learn about philosophy. It's criticizing beliefs, not just yours, not just other people's, but also our own. So go back to that idea that philosophy is the examined life. We're going to need to examine our own beliefs. Should I hold them or not hold them on the basis of these reasons that I've given for them? Should I revise them? So again, what's the point of studying some of this stuff? Again, we learn about influential arguments, many of which have influenced our society, form of government we have, what we do as individuals or as a society. Again, we develop independent learning, critical reasoning skills, reading comprehension, textual interpretation skills, written and oral communication skills. So those are things, many of those things are not exclusive to philosophy. They are, what the humanities do, right? Take a quick drink of water here. You may find yourself in a boardroom one day having to argue that we need to do this sort of thing versus this sort of thing. And again, the logical reasoning, rationally persuasive reasoning skills are central to that, right? And so you can get a lot out of philosophy if you do give it a shot. Some people are dismissive at the outset. I'm not sure there's anything that can be done to persuade them otherwise. But if you're, have a little bit of open mind about it, I think you'll really get something out of it. And so lastly here, let's turn to our philosophical aptitude test. And I don't want to take this too seriously. We're going to come back to some of these issues here next lesson in the logical and critical thinking lesson. But just as a way of starting to think and get an idea of what it means to think philosophically, we can analyze a claim here. So if you don't get this right away, it's okay. We'll come back to a reading that's devoted to this particular topic. It's the second reading that's involved in the next lesson on basic logic by Johnson. And there's a philosophical view called relativism. Lots of different ways of cashing out relativism. There's lots of ways of formulating these positions. Another thing that makes doing philosophy difficult because you have to analyze all of them. But one way of thinking about relativism is the idea that there are no universal truths and that all truth claims that assert a truth, in other words, right, or assertions, are relative to the individual, that they are only true for, I hate using quote marks, but true for particular people or particular cultures at particular times and places. And so here I have the claim there are no universal truths. Let's call that the relativist thesis, right? That there are no universal truths. So that claim denies that there are any such truths that are universal. They're saying something like all truths are, they're particular, not universal. So particular to the individual, right? And we can ask ourselves, well, does that claim make sense, logically speaking? And then to explain why or why not. And then, so notice that's a declarative statement. It's a proposition or a statement that asserts a truth. So that's what I mean by a truth claim, right? Declarative statements in English, on the face of them, their function in our language is to assert a claim, either a factual claim or at least a truthful claim. And we'll talk about the difference between a factual versus a logical truth later. But it's at least asserting a truth claim here, right? So it's making an assertion. So just think about what you're doing when you're asserting something. It looks like you're asserting it to be the case, that it's a truth, right? So if I say that there's a trash can, here's an empirical claim. If I say there's a trash can in the room, then I'm claiming that that proposition, that statement that there is a trash can in the room corresponds to some state of affairs in the world. Or if I make a claim about a square having 4 sides of equal length, I'm making a truth claim about a geometrical object, an abstract object, right? Here we have this claim, there are no universal truths, right? Well, for the sake of argument, and we'll do this a lot in philosophy, we'll entertain an idea without actually, we'll consider an idea or a claim without actually assenting to it, without actually believing it. Aristotle said that the mark of an educated mind is to entertain these ideas and figure out what they're about, right? So we can ask ourselves, is the claim that there are no universal truths, is that really true? And again, I'm going to reserve the claim, the word true for objective truth here, impartial, person neutral truths, as opposed to things like opinions that are subjective and maybe just, really are relative to the individual, like my taste in music or something like that. So here we have this claim, there are no universal truths. Well, should I believe that that claim itself, right? There's a reflective part, itself, is true or false, because it's making a claim about all truths, right? All truth claims, and that claim itself is asserting a truth, right? It's asserting a claim, or a truth claim, as I've said. Well, right away, most of you have probably picked up on something, that claim is itself a universal claim, right? It says no, and all would be another kind of universal claim, as opposed to some, or some are not, that sort of claim. So it says there are no universal truths. And again, that claim is itself asserting a truth, and it is a universal statement. So if there are no universal statements that are true, then that claim itself cannot be true. It looks like we have an example here of that relativism, at least if this is what we mean by relativism, there are no universal truths, that claim is self-defeating or self-contradictory, right? So let's walk through that. So the claim there are no universal truth itself, right? So there's the self-referential part of this. It asserts a universal truth. So assuming for the sake of argument that there are no universal truths is a true claim, well, then that logically implies that there's at least one universal truth, namely the truth of that claim itself. But since that claim explicitly denies that there are any universal truths, but implicitly presupposes its own truth, we get a contradiction, right? So I say here, but there are no universal truths, and there are some universal truths are the exact opposite of one another. So in other words, if we assume for the sake of argument that the claim there are no universal truths is true, then there is exactly one universal truth, which is the exact opposite of the explicit claim that's made. So implicitly, that claim's truth implies its exact opposite. It looks like it violates the law of non-contradiction. A statement and its negation, or its exact opposite, can't both be true at the same time in the same respect. So in philosophy, we call that a self-contradictory or self-defeating or self-refuting idea. Sometimes you might hear people call it a self-referentially incoherent idea. It's grammatically correct. It's a grammatically correct statement. It's not like it's jumbled up grammatically or something. It's just that logically speaking, it can't be the case because it violates the law of non-contradiction. Now notice we figured that out, not by measuring something in the world, but by thinking about the relationships of ideas that are involved in that claim. That's a little bit of what is involved in doing philosophy, right? So that's the lecture for today. I've tried to keep this one a little bit short because the next lecture, the next lesson, you do have 2 reading assignments for that particular lesson. So I wanted to keep it short today for you to have plenty of time to get through that next lesson. We kind of jump into the deep end a little bit next time. So I've even tried to shorten the reading a little bit for you there on one of those reading assignments. So if you have questions about this lesson, be sure and post your questions in the discussion forum, and I'll get back to you there. Other people can comment as well. If you don't have any questions, make sure you've worked through the reading questions and studying questions. For what is philosophy, again, the main things you want to have down here are our technical definition of philosophy and the basic subfields of academic philosophy. So those are kind of the two big things to get out of this section. So with that, we'll end this lesson. I hope y'all are doing well and staying safe. Wash your hands. Talk to y'all soon. Bye-bye.